Well, hello, it's Kate here and welcome to the very first Mosse on a Monday. Every month, the first Monday of the month, I'm going to choose 2 fiction and 2 non-fiction books that I've loved. That's all there is to it. There'll be quirky books, there'll be classic books, there'll be modern books, there'll be all sorts of books, some of which you will have read and some of which you'll be waiting to read or might be going back to after a long gap. Anyway, that's how it's going to work, so let me know what you think about all of this. And I'm going to start now, as anyone who knows me will not be surprised to know, with the very first choice, and it is going to be Agatha Christie. Of course it's going to be Agatha Christie. She is the queen of crime, of course, everybody knows that, but more importantly, she is the biggest selling author in the history of the world. Some people quibble a bit, they say things about Shakespeare and the Bible, but Agatha Christie has sold between 2 billion and 4 billion copies. Nobody's quite so sure how many it is. So I first discovered Agatha Christie when I was on a family holiday in Devon in the 1970s. And because it was a family holiday in England in the 1970s, it rained all the time. And my sisters and I were really fed up, and the whole place we were staying in smelled of cagoules and damp and paraffin heaters. And I'd read every single book on the shelf that I brought with me. And then I put my hand out and discovered this book called The Body in the Library by this author I'd never heard of called Agatha Christie. And I just read it in one sitting and I was like, oh, this is incredible. And then I did that thing when you fall in love with an author. I thought, I wonder if she's written any more books. And then of course I discovered that she'd written 66 detective novels, some 6 books under the name of Mary Westmacott. She'd written autobiography and travel books. You know, she was a prolific and wonderful writer, and at that stage was still alive and writing. So the book that I've chosen to start with, Sleeping Murder. Now you can see, this is the original hardback edition, beautiful purple colour. You can see it says Miss Marple's Last Case. This is not actually true. So the story behind the story of this novel is that in the war, nobody's exactly sure when this book was written, but during the Second World War, probably sometime in 1940-41 in the Blitz, Agatha Christie wrote a last Poirot, which is called Curtain, and a last Miss Marple, Sleeping Murder, just in case something happened to her, and she never got to finish the stories, if you like, of these characters that were now beloved by millions and now billions of readers. So Sleeping Murder is slightly out of sync. It was published posthumously in 1976 after Christie had died in January 1976, but it's set in the 1930s. And there's a young woman, Gwen Reed, who is coming to England for the first time, and she's just got married and she's looking for a house. And she's motoring along the south coast to places that are probably based on Torquay and Torbay, and it's a place called Dilmouth. And she has never been to England, also she thinks. Her husband has sent her ahead, they've come from New Zealand, and she can remember being born in India and then going to New Zealand. But little by little it comes out that there's a completely different story, that her father and mother had been married, then her father had married again. They're actually 2 different voyages. And so when she finds the house that she's been dreaming of, her perfect English house, she goes inside and she makes an offer for it, and she thinks, oh, wouldn't it be amazing? This room could have this beautiful wallpaper with these kind of flowers on it. And then when she gets into the room and she finds a cupboard, she opens the cupboard, and inside the cupboard is that exact wallpaper. So it's incredibly exciting because it's essentially a recovered memory story, but at the same time it is about old sins having long shadows. The idea that a murder, if somebody's got away with that years and years ago, they're not suddenly going to let it all be dug up. So Gwen and her husband Giles go into it rather like an adventure story, but actually the real murder is still there. The body is still hidden somewhere. And of course, Miss Marple comes in and starts to tease out the story. And at the final frame, Miss Marple, who is quite a young, vigorous 60-year-old at this stage, properly saves the day. She is the hero of the piece. I'm not going to tell you any more about it because you absolutely should read it. When it was going to be published in the first place, Agatha Christie was going to call it Murder in Retrospect, which of course makes sense. Then she was going to call it Cover Her Face, because Sleeping Murder, it comes from the Duchess of Malfi, cover her face, mine eyes dazzle. But then before the book could be published, the great P.D. James published a novel called Cover Her Face. So finally it was published as Sleeping Murder. So that is my very first recommendation. I'm going to hold up the edition that's available in the bookshops. That's my original one. It's published by HarperCollins, and trust me, you will never regret reading this great detective story. So what am I going to choose next? I'm going to look at my list I am actually going to choose this extraordinary book called Everything is True by Roopa Farooki. This was not the book I was going to do today, but I read this in one sitting this morning, and it's amazing. And so I'm afraid the other books got bumped, but it will come back, don't worry. I'm not going to tell you what it is. When it comes back, you will see that it's a wonderful book, but it was slightly more timeless than this. So Roopa Farooki is an extraordinary writer. I first came across her with her very first novel, Bittersweets, which won the Orange Award for New Writers back in 2000. It was shortlisted, it didn't win, it should have won. No, don't say that. It was a great book. The whole shortlist was fantastic. It was shortlisted in 2007, and it was her first novel. And in this book, she talks about how actually she's published 6 novels now and has 6 unpublished. And she's published 2 novels for children and has 4 unpublished. So you immediately get this sense of somebody who works incredibly hard. This is kind of a memoir, but it's also about the first 40 days of the pandemic. And why do I think you should read Roopa Farooki's book on this? And why have I bumped it to the top of my list? Well, it's because of this. In 2019, this really successful writer, who also still teaches creative writing, decided to go back to school and become a doctor. So from 2019, she's been a junior doctor, and she now works in a hospital on the southeast coast. And that in itself is mind-blowing. But of course, to have somebody who is a beautiful writer writing a book about this time is incredible. So the idea for this book for her came because at the beginning of 2020, her sister died of breast cancer. And Roopa was dealing with the grief of that and the family grief of that. And they're a Muslim family, so the burial had to happen quite quickly. And then at the back of all of this, there was this, was it a whisper? That there was a thing coming, this thing called COVID-19 that was, no, it was over at the other side of the world. It was in China. Oh, no, maybe it's a little bit closer. Oh, it's in Europe now. Oh, it's coming to us. And she, right at the beginning of this is what they call a book proof, so it's an early copy. The book won't look like this. We'll show you the jacket a bit later on. This is just an early one I've been lucky enough to be sent. And she says right at the beginning of it, she says, quotes this, quarantine, originally defined as a period of 40, 40 in French, 40 in Italian, days of isolation to prevent the spread of contagious disease. So this beautiful and heartbreaking and brilliant and furious and angry and oh so honest book is about those first 40 days. And all of us who were not working as first responders or in the medical service or part of politics, who didn't really know, we were only getting our news from the news, from the television, we felt like we knew nothing was happening. What is so absolutely unbelievable and infuriating is to be in the eyes of a junior doctor being told things like, there will be stuff called PPE for you when you get into work. And then of course get into work and there's a plastic pinny that somebody's got from the pound shop round the way. The complete lack of knowledge and the way that doctors and nurses and porters and anaesthetists and everybody working in the health service just kept every day living on their nerves, stepping up, discovering there would never be any holiday ever again. And of course what then happens is that Roopa becomes ill with COVID. Lots of doctors are not going into work because they don't know how to protect their families. And of course then Roopa Farooki, who was born in Pakistan and moved from Lahore to the UK when she was 7 years old, then noticing that almost all of the doctors and nurses who are dying are black people and brown people and people of colour. And I love that she's so honest about a lot of these things, that she says, I don't know what I'm doing. I've always been really chirpy, but now I'm just devastated and exhausted. And I know you're thinking, this sounds well and good, Kate, but the book's not out and we've had enough about COVID. You have had enough about COVID. We've all had enough about COVID, but you know what? They're still working. This book comes out in January, so give it a lot of pre-publication. I said I wasn't going to ever do books that weren't out because it's so annoying, but I just feel because of what's going on with doctors at the moment, and they are still there on the front line, that I can decide not to engage with it anymore. I can stay at home and be safe, but she can't, and neither can all her colleagues. So this is an amazing read. It's funny and it's witty, and you will not regret it. You will think, yeah, I've really I've really spent some time in the company of an extraordinary woman and all of her colleagues. So this book is going to be published by Bloomsbury in January, but trust me, if you order it now, you will make an author very, very happy. So there we are, Roopa Farooki, published by Bloomsbury. Everything is true, and the title comes from another epigram at the beginning. After you have read this story of great misfortune, you will blame the author for your own insensitivity, accusing of wild exaggeration of flights of fancy. But rest assured, this tragedy is not a fiction. Everything is true. Balzac, Le Père Goriot. Right, on the table with that one, and I was going to do my next novel, but actually it makes much more sense to go on to my second non-fiction choice, which is this magnificent book, 4,000 Weeks, Time and How to Use It, by Oliver Burkeman, who many of you will know from his Guardian columns, his happiness columns in The Guardian. Now, one of the things that Roopa Farooki talks about is how we use time, the fact that they never have any time, and there's never any time to even go to the loo or have a sandwich or whatever. And this book, the Oliver Burkeman book, is just a wonderful, it's almost like a novel about human ideas about time. So it is philosophy in one way. In another way, it's about self-help. But one of those self-help books that isn't full of platitudes, that basically says to you, if you do all the right things, then you're going to be happy forever. Because we all know that's not how life works. Life goes up and down like this, however much you try to manage stuff. But Oliver Burkeman has got a wonderful theory, which is very straightforward. 4,000 weeks, what does that mean? Why is that the title? Well, that is because if we all live to an average lifespan, which brilliantly in our part of the world that I'm talking to you from today is about 80 years old, then that's how many weeks you will have, 4,000 weeks. So if you think of that, that's 4,000 Saturday nights, that's 4,000 making packed lunches on a Monday, but not the rest of the week. It's just both an enormous amount to think about, but a tiny amount. That when I read that, I thought that can't be right. You know, there are other things in the book, like, for example, that human civilization is actually only 6,000 years old. So if you think of things that seem a long way in the past to us, like the ancient Egyptians, that's only 35 lifetimes ago. It's just mind-blowing, really. It seems so tiny. So this book is about the concepts of time and how we have this idea that if only we can master time, or we can spend it better, then all things will be easier and happier. You know, that this is the pursuit of happiness comes in mastering other things. Whereas what Burkeman says is very straightforward, that time is just time. It isn't separate from life. It isn't something that we can control or master, it just happens. And it's about how we think about it and how we use it rather than spend it that matters. And so what I loved was this sense, I'm checking my notes because he puts it so beautifully. So he talks about the uncontrollability of the past and the unknowability of the future. And my wonderful husband always has this phrase about the debt to the future. But what about if you just do the thing you're doing without spending all of your life thinking, well, if I do this and I do that and I get to the bottom of my inbox, I get to the bottom of my to-do list, you know, tick, tick and tick, then suddenly there will be this nirvana waiting for us. It's very learned, but not in an off-putting way, in any way whatsoever. So he throws lots of sort of new age guru thinking in with classic philosophers, you know, Heidegger and all of these people, lots of novelists and other writers. And all he's trying to say is just shift our way of thinking. And one of the things that was very significant for him was becoming a parent. And that thing that many of us who are carers or parents or who look after other people know, which is that things take as long as they take. And I've thought about this quite a lot, both as a carer, writing about being a carer, but also as a writer of historical fiction. And my latest book, The City of Tears, is set in 1572 to 1594. And I have to stop myself when I'm writing, saying 5 minutes later they arrived at ... Because of course people didn't think like that. You know, before the Industrial Revolution, with clocking in and clocking out became a thing and a way of measuring time more accurately, people got up when it was light and they went to bed when it was dark and they did the task and the task took as long as it took. And people would say, well, how long will that be? And they will say, it will be as long as it takes to shear a sheep, for example. So learning about time is something I try to think about as a writer. But this book is just so uplifting. And there's so many moments. You can see, if I hold that up to you, can you see there are loads of pages turned down? My husband was also reading the book and he was turning down other pages. So the whole book looked like a sort of porcupine had exploded. So it's just one of those books that you will really enjoy. You can dip in and out, or you can read it in one sitting, but it's a really helpful way to think about how we spend our lives and the idea that life is now, and time is just part of that. So this is, just to repeat, 4,000 Weeks, Time and How to Use It by Oliver Burkeman, and it's published by The Bodley Head. So that is time dealt with, and we are nearly at the end. So the final book, now this was a really difficult choice, my final novel for this first show, because of course I want to talk about novels that I really, really love. And this is a novel that I really love, but I also admire and think it's one of the great novels of the 20th century, possibly of ever. But it's tough. It's a tough old book, and it's the debut novel by a little-known writer called Toni Morrison. And this is a very early 1970 edition. So Toni Morrison, of course, now everybody knows, Nobel Prize winner, Pulitzer Prize winner, one of the great writers. She died in 2019. But she was an academic, she worked in publishing, and she started to write her first novel on the back of many of the civil rights discussions that were going on in the 70s. And one of the reasons she wanted to write was to put female Black experience on the page, but particularly the experience of girls on the page. So this, her first novel, came out in 1970, and if you've got an old edition like I have, the reviews are hilarious because they're very supportive, but they say, oh, you know, she's one to watch. This is very, and of course, with hindsight, this just seems hilarious. But of course, that's what it's like when you publish your first novel. So it's set in a place called Lorain, Ohio, in the very, the years after the Great Depression and still living the consequences of it. So it starts in autumn 1941. And it's a very depressed, mostly Afro-Caribbean, I'll say this again, a very depressed Afro-American community. There are white families and there are shades of racism within the whole community, but there are also a lot of people with enormous need. And it's a book about poverty, it's a book about misogyny, it's a book about sexual abuse, it's a book about the explicit consequences of racism, but also the implicit and often hidden ones, namely the internalization of a level of racism that has been going on, Jim Crow, the lynchings, and the civil rights movement that is making changes, but it hasn't got, obviously, to a place like that in 1941 because these things are all still in the future. And so the lead character, although she's rather like a Carson McCullers character in Heart is the Lonely Hunter Say, Pecola Breedlove, she's not, she's quiet and she's very much a girl more sinned against than sinning. And she is seen by everybody in the town and is told all the time that she is ugly. And it's not just about the very dark colour of her skin, but it's about everything about her. She doesn't have any self-esteem, she doesn't have any confidence. She lives in a very difficult family. Her father is a drunk and is sexually abusive to her. Her mother is, is doing her best and actually goes to work for a white family and in a way is nurturing that white family rather than being able to be at home looking after her own daughter and her son. And much of the novel is narrated by Claudia McTeer, who is the daughter of the foster family that Pecola is sent to when she becomes pregnant by her father. And at all moments, there is no sympathy for her, there is no empathy for her. And where does the title come from? Well, it comes from the brilliance of understanding a very straightforward way that a child might understand about the lack of power, how it works. She sees that the people with blonde hair and blue eyes, they're okay. They have power in this community. She doesn't. But she feels if she had blue eyes, then maybe things would be different for her. And one of the incredible things that Morrison does, and this is a first novel, is that she sets it up against the the kind of very mealy-mouthed discussions about what a perfect American family is at the time, and the Dick and Jane books. And Dick and Jane were this, perfect 2.4 children, I mean, there are two of them obviously, white American family. And so the first lines in the book are these: "Here is the house. It is green and white. It has a red door. It is very pretty. Here is the family. Mother, father, Dick and Jane live in the green and white house. They are very happy. See Jane. She has a red dress. She wants to play. Who will play with Jane?" And everything about this idealised life that is nothing to do with the life that a young girl Peccola can have in this environment. And then I just have to show you this. It's really hard to hold it up to the camera. So you see the first paragraph, and then you see the same paragraph but a much smaller point size. And then you see all run together, because the experience of these children in this community is not the experience they're being told. And of course, what do they take from that? That it's their fault that they don't fit in with that. So it starts in autumn and it goes through winter into spring, and it is a beautiful and challenging novel. And I can remember the first time I read it. I didn't read it when it came out in 1970. I would only have been 9 or 10 then. But I did read it when I was a teenager. And I can't remember where I was, but I can absolutely see myself with this book. So it must have been after whenever this particular edition was published. It's not a brand new one. Let me have a look. It's 1981. So it must have been about then. And I can see myself sitting at the bottom of a staircase with this book, finishing it and just sitting there. And at that moment thinking, more than any other novel I've read, that's why novels matter. Your whole world view of something can be changed because a novel takes you there. And that's what this novel was for me. And I'm going to do a final showy-offy thing, which I shouldn't really do, but I've been lucky enough to interview lots of writers over my career, and I finally got to interview the great Toni Morrison at Hay in 1998 at the Hay Literary Festival. And I took this book because it meant so much to me, and she very sweetly signed it. And I cannot tell you what it was like to interview somebody like that, who genuinely, through her novels, I believe, has changed the world. So that's it. That's it for this week. 4 really different type of books, 2 novels, 2 non-fiction. You came and you stayed, I hope. So I hope you've really enjoyed it. All the books, this one is published by Vintage, and all the information about the books will be on the site, so you'll be able to buy them or borrow them from the library, whatever you want to do. But for now, all I can say is do join me again. Monday the 6th of December will be the second Mosse on a Monday. But for now, whatever you do, just keep reading. See you then. Bye.